Okay, David, we can talk now. How are you? David, we haven't really spoken since Halloween.
Right.
Good to see you again, man. And welcome to the Silver Wave Film Festival in its 20th year up here in New Brunswick, just up the I-95 from you down in Boston.
Yes, yes. Well, it's wonderful to be back, virtually, of course. And we showed our last film at the Silver Wave Festival, and it was. I would love to be there right now, as we were just talking about. I would be happy to be anywhere else other than this strife-torn third world country I'm living in here, where we have this despotic regime that's refusing to acknowledge democracy, and the virus is basically burning through our country like a wildfire.
Mm.
So aside from that, all good.
So you know what? All you need to do is cross the border. Tell them that you got to come hang out with the Silver Wave people. You got to do the 2-week quarantine, get the swab, and hang out with us for 6 months till you get kicked out.
I thank you. I would love that. Are you sure the Royal Mounties would allow me to allow an American across the border? I don't know. I think we're verboten.
Well, dude, it's interesting. Uh, we spoke a week, I guess, on Halloween. It's the last time we actually spoke, and that was before the election. And um, it, all the things that you just mentioned, all the challenges, the social challenges, political challenges that we're seeing happening right now, not only in America but everywhere. And we can't kid ourselves. It's happening here in Canada as well. Like there's an imbalance in the force that needs rebalancing, if you will. Uh, One fear that a lot of us have that are really have a lot of focus on the environment and sustainability and climate change is that the spotlight has kind of been taken off for rightful reasons in a way in this particular point of time, perhaps. But the story that you just told is a story that of the right whales, which is very much a New Brunswick story. It's a Maine story, a Massachusetts story, Quebec story. Um, I mean, we hear snippets of this on the radio, on the news that 9 right whales were killed in 2019, I think it was, and
Right.
the numbers just keep climbing, and we just hear these little these news bites, and you don't really know what to do. You don't know what it really means, and then we get to see your film, Entangled, and it really goes deep into this tale that is it's heartbreaking essentially, but in a way it's the most important time in 2020 for you to release this film because the spotlight does need to shine on these issues as well. So why don't we just start with how did this film come to be, like your passion for the story?
Sure. Let me just say that I agree with everything you just said, and there was definitely an urgency for me to bring this film into the world as soon as we possibly could, and we had all of a sudden, to skip forward, and then I'll go back to answer your question. But we finished the first rough cut of the film, the day before the shutdown started, and all of a sudden, we had to start thinking about, well, what do we do from here? Our primary funders pulled out of the film. We had a broadcaster lined up. They pulled out because it seemed like the world was ending, and why would they be interested in a film about whales? And there were all kinds of existential issues that, of course, I think a lot of us were confronting when we experienced the shutdown. But we felt really passionately that this film should be completed as soon as possible and be brought into the world, regardless of a pandemic shutting down theaters and maybe making opportunities to share the film on different levels. We had no idea that there would be virtual film festivals at that point. So we decided to proceed. But to back up and answer your question, there are a few things that sort of fueled this film. The first, I would say, was my last film. So let me just step back and say I moonlight as a filmmaker, and my day job is as a reporter for the Boston Globe, where I have worked for many years now as the environment reporter. And in that job, I've covered how climate change is affecting all aspects of our world, and no more so than our oceans, which are vital to New Brunswick and to Massachusetts and all of New England. And we've seen in many ways the impact of climate change more pronounced in our oceans than anywhere else. And so I made a film a few years ago called Sacred Cod, which was all about the impact of climate change on the ability of this iconic species in New England. So it was called Sacred Cod because there's this wooden cod that hangs from the rafters of the Massachusetts state legislature, and cod is what brought Europeans to settle in Massachusetts. The Pilgrims made their living off of cod in effect, and it's what brought great wealth. And then because of climate change, arguably overfishing existed for many years, but climate change made it very difficult for the population to bounce back. And so I made a film about that. And then I made another film about the impact of climate change on the lobster industry, which was called Lobster War, which was screened at Silver Wave last year, or the year before, I can't even remember at this point. And that was a film about, in essence, how climate change was fueling this centuries-old dispute between the United States and Canada over this rock in the middle of the Gulf of Maine between Nova Scotia and down East Maine called Machias Seal Island. And nobody really cared about that rock until all of a sudden the lobster in the waters around that island, which both countries refer to as the gray zone, suddenly became flush with lobster. And all of a sudden, the Canadians who long ceded the waters to the Mainers started to say, well, those are our waters too, and we're going to fish them, because all of a sudden they were flushed with lobster as the waters warmed, and the lobster population there, rose to a higher level, exploded really, and there were these huge catches. So while I was making that film, I learned a lot about the right whales and the issues confronting the right whales, particularly the entanglement in fishing lines, and how these entanglements affect the whales, and what role climate change was playing. But there was one other, of course, bigger thing that sort of really ignited my interest in telling this story. And it was this report that came out from the United Nations last year. And that report suggested that there were 1 million species by the end of this century that were likely to go extinct. And I wrote a story about it for the paper, but it was just like this unfathomably large number. And like, how do you even begin to wrap your brain around that loss of life, of biodiversity? And I started to think, how do you tell that story? And I thought the way you can tell that story is through one species, one particularly iconic species, one that people can identify with, or they do identify with, the largest whale or marine mammal that is on the brink of extinction at this point, and that is the North Atlantic right whale. And from there, I started to learn about this effort here in this country to try to figure out how to deal with the increase in mortalities. And then I learned about how the whales were moving into Canadian waters, and you guys were confronting all of these issues, and that's where the narrative emerged.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful one. And I would just, first of all, just as a filmmaker, really cool story to hear how you've been able to kind of block these stories, just because you're working in the space as a journalist, but also your previous 2 films just kind of opened the doors to these other. It kind of reminds me of my first TV series being a wrestling show, and I'm not even a wrestling fan. that led to another wrestling show that led to an MMA show. I'm like, how did this happen? Anyway, but as filmmakers, it's kind of neat to see these doors that open, when you're doing this. Now, when I was watching it, what I got excited about was the innovation. Now, there might be some people watching this right now that didn't see the film. I just watched it for the second time right before we hopped onto this call. And I watched it with my 7-year-old. And we only had a chance to get about 30 minutes into the film on my second viewing, and because I wanted her to see it. And she said, Daddy, why can't they just not use ropes and just go dive down and pick up trap by trap? And I was like, well, there was a time that's how it was, And but I thought it was a very good question. Now, for those who haven't watched the film, you do discuss, different innovations in traps that don't have to have a rope going from the bottom of the seabed up to the buoy at the top, which is what is entangling these beautiful whales. And when we talked about just a minute ago about you didn't know if there's going to be film festivals happening at the beginning of COVID, look how fast technology everybody just jumped and found a solution, right? What do you feel it's going to take for the industry to jump to that technological advancement and innovation? What's it going to take? You finished this film with funders pulling out, right? You made it work. Can the industry bear those costs? At the end of the film, it shows record sales years in the lobster industry in Maine. It's not that there's no money in this system. Anyway, I'll stop painting the picture here. But do you think we're at a point now where we can innovate our way out of this?
Hopefully, I think that is a viable possibility. So I think it was last week or the week before, there was this annual North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium, where I should say there was bad news and good news. The bad news was that the previous estimate for the size of the right whale population was 411 whales, I believe, and it was revised downward last week to 356. So in just one year, the estimated population for the whales fell by something like 13%, which is catastrophic for a species. And they're believed to be like 80 or 85 breeding females. I think a figure I heard was that only 68 females in the remaining population of whales have been known to give birth since 2017, meaning that the estimated population, because there are others that could potentially give birth, are even smaller than what's known or what has been believed. So all of these things are really bad news for the species. But at the same meeting, there was a lot of discussion about all kinds of new technologies that could potentially, make a dramatic impact on the primary cause of death for right whales now, which has been entanglements in fishing lines, exactly what you just described. And there are a whole slew of technologies that are being tested. Quite a number of them have been tested in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, I believe. There was a big meeting, I think last summer, maybe not this past summer, but the summer before, in Halifax, where there was a whole kind of like bazaar for ropeless technologies. It is conceivable, and what is expected is that ultimately, if they ever emerge from the black hole of the American White House, where the proposed regulations to reduce mortality of right whales in the United States are now being held in some kind of shadowy purgatory where we don't know what's going to become of them. But if these rules ever actually get released, my understanding is that they will allow for ropeless fishing in certain areas, or at least testing of it. the big deal is this. I mean, or the crux of the matter is that the technology is improving, but it's really expensive, and you're not going to have voluntarily get the 5,000 or so lobstermen in Maine and elsewhere in New England to voluntarily buy all this equipment. So there would have to be some kind of federal subsidy to make it happen, or there would be closures where fishermen would be allowed to fish if they use the technology, giving them potentially more incentive to spend the money on this. You're right, there is quite a bit of money in this industry. I mean, over the last decade or so, the catch, at least in Maine, for lobster has been over 100 million pounds every year. That's what in kilograms. I mean, it's an immense amount, and so lobstermen have done well for the most part, aside from over the past year where they've been hit by the closure of a lot of the restaurant industry, which of course has been dramatic and painful and had an impact on the entire seafood industry throughout the world, but especially in our waters here in New England, at least that I'm familiar with. In any event, there is this technology. It needs to be further developed. Lobstermen need incentives, and there probably will need to be subsidies to really, have it be adopted in a widespread way.
It's interesting, as I'm sure you've been following the Nova Scotia lobster crisis that's happening with the Mi'kmaq and the commercial lobster scene. And it's neat because we do still have restaurants open in Atlantic Canada and Halifax. It's neat to see how certain restaurants have been taking a stand by taking lobster off the menu, even in famous seafood restaurants, just to stand up for the Mi'kmaq, saying until this is resolved. Right. It'd be interesting to see what the consumer response could be, almost like a fair trade, logo or something that, or how will the lobster fisheries say that, they've caught this lobster without endangering whales or other species, like it's hard to say how a consumer could play a role in this.
Well, let me just first say that I have been following at a great distance the story in Nova Scotia. And if this wasn't pandemic times or end times, whichever it is, although it seems like you live in utopia up there. So.
I just laugh and smile all the time, so don't worry. I'm panicking on the inside.
Yeah, well, comparatively, we're living in a dystopia here. But I should say, if it wasn't pandemic times, it would be a really compelling story for me to want to come up there to cover, and maybe it seems like there's a film in that in that conflict. But I would say there are a number of efforts to create whale-safe lobster labeling. There is this organization called the Marine Stewardship Council, which if you buy seafood, you'll see a blue label that says MSC certified, meaning that it's considered sustainably fished seafood. And the concern, or this organization, earlier this year, it basically decertified Maine lobster because of whale regulations. And so lobster in Maine, and thus I think most of the United States, American lobster has lost its MSC certification, which was a big blow to the lobster industry. And it was because of entanglement in fishing lines.
I suppose New Brunswick would be part of that as well.
It's a good question. I don't know if it extends to New Brunswick. I don't see why it wouldn't. because you guys have the same issues as we do.
It's identical. We used to have a lot of right whales in the Bay of Fundy, but
Right.
as you know, and as the film shows, they've, and of course we're thinking climate change and other, taking the food up north a little bit up to the St. Lawrence, and we haven't been seeing the right whales, and perhaps the data is showing we're not seeing a lot of entanglement in the Bay of Fundy, and maybe that's got something to do with it. But the St. Lawrence has an issue with not only lines but also vessel strikes. And I remember a number of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, there was a big initiative to change the shipping lanes in the Bay of Fundy for this direct reason. And I'm sure we had many more right whales at that time. So clearly there's been an issue that's been going on for quite some time.
Yeah, actually, so for the first time in the memory of scientists who've been studying right whales, especially in a place like Campobello, where there's a lot of research that was conducted every summer in the Bay of Fundy, there was this summer, for the first time, 0 right whales seen in that area. And that was unprecedented for the researchers. And as the film explains, that arguably is the result of climate change, in that the primary food source for right whales, which traditionally for as long as scientists have been studying them, were concentrated in or around the Bay of Fundy in the summer, and that's where they would come and feed. And because the population of this rice-sized piece of plankton called Calanus finmarchicus, because that population declined by an estimated 90% in those summer feeding grounds, the whales moved. And that's how they ended up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where they were found for the first time in significant numbers in 2017, which is why we lost 12 right whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence that year, which was catastrophic for the species. That's 12 we know about. We lost, I think, a record known number of right whales that summer, which was 17. I just heard an estimate that the known deaths are only represent about 40% of actual deaths. And one model estimated that in 2017, we actually lost something like 42 whales. But these are, these are estimates and we don't know. But the bottom line is that things are changing, and, places where they used to be, they aren't, and they have been moving in unpredictable ways. And actually, one of the reasons, my understanding, is why there was a substantial increase. So in 2017, there were 12 whales that died in Canadian waters. Then in 2018, there were none that died in the Gulf of St. Lawrence or elsewhere in Canada, because there were measures that were taken that included closures and delay in the changing times of the fishing season and so on. But in 2019, those regulations were relaxed, and they also sort of were outdated in the sense that the regulations applied to where they were seen in the previous summers, but then they turned up in different places, particularly in shipping lanes, where there were I don't believe there were any ship speed limits, or very little enforcement of ship speed limits. And we lost a lot of whales. We lost 9 whales in the summer of 2019, and many of them because of ship strikes.
I want to encourage people who are watching right now to pop some questions into the Zoom. If you have any questions at all, Kat will send them over to me. I do have a comment, not a question. This is from our friend Lisa Roblick. Many emotional support Canadians standing by for you, David. Happy face hugs. That's from Lisa.
Thank you.
I'm right with Lisa on that. And it's interesting watching the film too, because in a way you feel a little sad, because the film really shows that, in the latest years, most of the deaths are happening under our watch in Canada. Right. And then there's this one scene where people are like, we gotta put pressure on the Canadian government. And yes, we do, but it's really important. And let's just talk about the filmmaking side of this for a second. What I appreciated about it was the incredible balance. And I've done similar type of projects where you're trying to tell a story on a very polar opposite two different communities that are battling against something, and you as a filmmaker have a direction, but you're still telling a balanced story. So why don't we just talk about that a little bit? How did you gain the trust of all the stakeholders? Because you did a great job keeping this balanced, even though it's very clear what the motive of the film was, but it was a very respectfully done film.
Thank you. When you're making a film or writing a newspaper story or doing any form of journalism, it's always sort of a shot in the dark. You don't know who's going to slam the door on in your face. You don't know who's going to agree to talk to you. And I have to say, I was incredibly heartened and thankful about how many people actually sorry, I see someone crawling.
Oh gosh. You're seeing I didn't see that. Kaya, you've been caught. There you go. That's my eldest. Yeah. Okay. Oh, and here comes another one. This
Okay.
watch the film with me.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, like
you're the bacon, right?
She dressed up as bacon for Halloween, and it was awesome.
Your dad made the world's cutest video of you jumping. I love that.
You're famous.
Thank you for watching my movie. You've done more than my children have.
She watched intently. It was really cool. And this, again, the format was really well done. And, if it passes a 7-year-old test, like she was asking the right questions. It was great.
That is awesome. Yes. I'm very impressed. Your children have the attention span greater than my boys. It's hard to get them to pay attention for a sustained period of time. But anyway, to answer your question, I mean, like there was one group that didn't want to talk. I was fortunate, I think, in that I was able to represent different points of view, even of this one organization, which was the representative of the Maine Lobstermen, the Maine Lobstermen's Association, who I would have liked to talk to in more depth, but their side I was able to reflect their point of view because they were all speaking in these public meetings. And so that enabled me, or in these rallies. So it made it easier, but there were, some folks, who amazingly spoke to me and looked in the camera and said, "Fuck the whales."
Yeah. I was just going to bring that up. It's like good on you for building trust to have people just to speak that clearly, and a sidetrack to that very comment. It was just really interesting to me because I want to believe that person doesn't really believe that. However, they're in a bubble thinking that their whole career and their way of lifestyle and living is about to be destroyed by the government, which is right. A narrative that Trump has certainly promoted. And as I was watching it, I was like, I'm always trying to understand the supporters of Trump. It's just straight up. And I think you captured it really well in Maine, where it's there's no gray in the middle. It's black or white. It's either you vote for Trump and this whale thing will go away. Nobody cares about that, and we'll be able to keep on fishing. But if you look at the core of what that is, it's the fear of losing something, right? And what a powerful statement that guy made. Unfortunately, it's completely awful and heartbreaking hearing him say that. But it's an attitude. People are like complacent. They're like, yeah, fuck it.
I would say that isn't there are a lot of ways to caricature Trump supporters, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I would say that's not an exclusively Trump point of view or an American point of view. I think, there was, I think it's in Caracat, New Brunswick. There was a big protest a year and maybe 2 years ago
All the
when the
cages.
whales, yeah, when the whales first showed up in New Brunswick, and there were all these closures, and there were, very similar protests and anger and fights in New Brunswick and along the Acadian Peninsula. A lot of anger and a lot of emotion, a lot of intense conflict, and screaming. I mean, you guys are probably more blunt than we are when you're peeved, and the fishermen certainly let the ministers there know about their anger. I think and it's sort of a transcendental sort of thing, form of anger that I think transcends, borders, and you can find these kind of issues in many countries where, fishermen who are incredibly independent-minded people, part of the reason why people are drawn to the sea and drawn to the life of fishing is because you're your own boss. They're like the last remaining cowboys in some ways. They roam free on the ocean, and and while they have to live with many regulations, they don't have anyone telling them what time they have to get out of bed. They go when they want to go to sea and that sort of thing. So, these regulations, any regulations, but particularly regulations that tell them that they can't go to sea, or that, they have to spend money on a lot of equipment, is easy to piss them off.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, and I think that's the thing that I've been trying to toil with is the whole what's at stake. What is it that's making people not care about this endangered species, one of potentially a million? And it's self-interest, and I don't say that in a damning way. It's just like we are human, and we're always looking for ways for our own survival as a species. However, when it comes to money, especially making a lot of money, people get protectionist about it, and and I think that's what you've been able to capture in a, and it's not just the lobster industry. This spans all industries.
Right. Yeah. I'm reminded of this wonderful quote from a fisherman in Lobster War, from Grand Manan. And I remember him saying something to the effect that, if it was like, a few $100s, if there was, it's okay, but if you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, I'm not budging. He said, I'm gonna lay my, my claim. I'm gonna put my flag. I am not gonna stop when you're talking about that kind of money. So, and in places like Maine and places like Miscou Island, where the fishing is the way of life and the lifeblood of the economy, and what people have and what sustains them, you can recognize and appreciate or empathize with their great frustration that all of a sudden, especially in a place like the Acadian Peninsula, all of a sudden these whales show up out of the blue, and suddenly their investments, these people have mortgages on boats, they spend a lot of money for sometimes short fishing seasons, and if you lose that window, your life is, your way of life is potentially significantly affected. Your ability to pay your mortgage on your house, on your boat, on your car, that's difficult, especially in isolated places, like the far reaches of the Acadian Peninsula or down East Maine, where that's all they have. So, I mean, I deeply appreciate and empathize with their concerns. And my hope is that, that when people watch a film like this, or in my previous films, that their takeaway is that, number one, climate change is not some distant abstract threat, but one that is having a very real impact on people's lives right now, and perhaps no more noticeably than on our oceans. And number two, that while we need to take these changes very seriously and reduce the impact on our species for many different reasons, particularly the precipitous loss of whales, we need to about how any regulations impact our brothers and sisters who work in the fishing industry, who I have great compassion for their plight. So my hope is that, people look at this story in a nuanced way, where it's not like there's, black or white. There's not good and evil. You can understand why someone says fuck the whales and not necessarily just caricature them.
And not throw hate at them for that perspective, because
you can understand why they're coming from. I mean, that particular fisherman, actually, despite his despite the vulgarity, in his language, actually, made a relatively reasonable point of view. In that his point of view was, look, these whales are going extinct whether we pull our fishing gear out of the water or not. And I mean, I don't know if I agree with that, but so should we go extinct too, is essentially his point.
Yeah. And thanks for bringing up the empathy, the empathy side of this, which, as a filmmaker and a journalist, that's it's in a way what we do, is to help people see, empathize with the other side of a story. And great job. I got a comment and a question. Comment from Don is very impressed with David's knowledge and research. Wonderful film and production. And from Lisa, the theory that the food source is migrating north for colder waters follows a similar thesis regarding the disappearance of the Atlantic salmon. Is this a trend you're seeing in regards to other species in the waters around New England?
Sorry, I'm reading this as you're speaking. Thank you, Don, first of all, for your comment. I appreciate that. I am not that familiar with the Atlantic salmon issues. I think there are other species that we have seen being affected by climate change, and we're seeing all kinds of movement of species from warm waters that are warming too much, moving further north. There's a researcher at Rutgers University in New Jersey that has this great study showing basically showing the northern migration of all kinds of species. And one of the things that I used to say is that the potential end of the conflict that my last film, Lobster War, focused on is, the lobster going to be moving further into Canadian waters. And so there might be less of a reason to fight over the gray zone. With salmon, there are other issues involved. And that has a lot to do with development and dams. And so we've lost a huge amount of our salmon population because of rivers where dams have been built, and the salmon that would spawn in these rivers can't reach their spawning grounds, and that's a problem. And then there's all kinds of issues of runoff into these waters and pollution in these waters, and how the runoff and increased precipitation that we hear in our region from New England up through New Brunswick, increased precipitation is what climate change it has in store for us, but not just steady precipitation, but bursts of precipitation, meaning that flooding is more likely. We're actually, going to be in this weird thing that kind of like what we experienced to some extent this summer, at least here in New England, which was drought conditions and then major storms, which increases flooding. And what happens is when there's more flooding, that causes more runoff, and that changes the chemistry of our estuaries and our rivers, and that increases things like acidification, changing the pH balance of our waters. All of these things could be affecting salmon, but I haven't written or written that much about Atlantic salmon, so I can't really speak that authoritatively about it.
It'll be the fourth film in the series.
Right.
So, as we come close to the end of our conversation, last time you and I spoke, you told me about that magic hour moment coming into Miscou Island, and can you just recount that story about the investment of getting here at the last moment, how you got here? Paint the picture, because most New Brunswickers watching this will say, yeah, of course, like they could totally relate to this particular story. But
yeah. So in the course of making this film, I really wanted to be able to get close to a whale. One of the linchpins of making the film was I got a permit to fly drones over whales, which was, an important thing to be able to tell the story, to be able to show the whales. We tried actually to get a permit to get in the water with whales, but the Endangered Species Act, or the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the United States, makes that illegal. And so we weren't able to actually get in the water to film underwater. That one shot in the opening of the film was actually shot in Canada. And it's one of the only shots I know of underwater footage of a North Atlantic right whale. That all said, so when the first whale died in the summer of 2019, in the course of us making this film, I knew I had to get up there as soon as possible to witness the necropsy and to try to tell the story of what happened. And the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans gave me less than 24 hours notice about when and where the necropsy was going to happen. And as soon as I found out, an hour later, I was, collecting all of my gear and got on a flight, this tiny plane that took me, I think, to Ottawa, and then Toronto, or vice versa, and then to it's Fredericton, where we arrived at midnight, and then had to rent a car and drive 3.5 hours north to Miscou Island, where we arrived, 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. And the necropsy was supposed to happen, at 7 a.m. that morning. And we were supposed to stay in an Airbnb, but it didn't make any sense. And I was so glad we didn't do that, because we had this incredibly amazing moment as we were just looking out at the sea with the fishing boats heading out, and the golden light reflecting off their windows, and it was just this incredibly perfect sunrise. And all of a sudden, when the sun just kind of broke over the horizon, and we had no idea where the whale was, we had no idea where we were. We were just sort of told, the general area where to go. All of a sudden, in the distance, I saw what are they called? An excavator kind of thing. And I could see the outline of what looked like a whale on the beach in the distance. And there was nobody there. And all of a sudden, I basically took all my gear, started running toward this creature. And it was just I had this really powerful moment, as someone who had spent months at that point working on this film, and suddenly I was eyeball to eyeball with this incredibly beautiful, massive creature that had been dragged to shore the night before, and there was nobody else on the beach. And it was just this really moving moment for me to sort of commune with this creature, and also get this incredible golden light footage of the water sort of lapping on the remains of this whale. And there was also this shot of like the rope around its fluke, which was just evocative of what causes what the film was about.
Beautiful work, man. It was just epic. So this kind of brings us to the end, David, and a massive thank you for making the film. And it is so much of a New Brunswick story. It's cool to see an American filmmaker telling a story that's so relevant to us here in our province, which is amazing. And what are different ways for people to follow your work and be in touch if they choose to?
Well, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is at DAVABEL, which I'll put in the chat here. Oops. And my website is this, which I'm also putting in the chat, where people can see more of my work and find links to my work. You can follow my writing in the Boston Globe, and of course you can stay up to date with screenings and other news about right whales through the website for the film, which I just put also in the chat, entangled-film.com. And I'll also provide my email address here if anyone would like to talk, or where we started was the challenge of bringing a film into the world during a pandemic. And while that has had its sort of real challenges and low points, also provided this great new way of sharing the film. And we've been arranging all these virtual screenings. So if anybody who's listening to this has interest in a virtual screening of our film, you can feel free to reach out to me. And it's been this really nice way of reaching audiences and groups that I would not have ordinarily shared the film with, or at least in that kind of way. And I'd be happy to do that. So anyone can reach out.
David, it's a pleasure, man. And I'm sure this will not be the last time we speak. So looking forward to watching your next film about following the salmon in the Atlantic.
Salmon, yeah. Okay.
That's the next one.
Folks have been trying to get me to make a film about sharks.
Well, that's a good natural next step as well.
We'll see. We'll see. I feel
like David, you take care. Thanks everybody for watching. Chat with you all soon. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye.